You're a royal physician in the Palace of Madrid, and the year is 1834. The king is dead, but your work isn't finished. You've been summoned to the private chambers of the late Ferdinand VII for a task so bizarre, so unprecedented, that you question your own sanity. The Queen Regent Maria Cristina stands before you with tears in her eyes and a request that chills your blood. Your hands tremble as you approach the bed where Ferdinand's body lies. Even in death, the man who terrorized Spain for 2 decades seems to mock you from beyond the grave. But it's not his face that draws your attention. It's what lies beneath the silk sheets. The thing that defined his reign as much as his cruelty, his paranoia, or his betrayals. The anatomical monstrosity that historians would whisper about for centuries but never dare write in their official accounts. Ferdinand VII's member, his grotesquely oversized, bizarrely shaped endowment that was simultaneously the source of his deepest shame and his most twisted pride. As you begin the preservation process, your mind wanders to the stories you've heard whispered in the palace corridors. Stories of special cushions, of screaming wives, of desperate attempts to produce an heir despite nature's cruel joke. You realize you're not just preserving flesh and blood, you're preserving the physical embodiment of a reign that was itself deformed, oversized and ultimately destructive to everything it touched. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. To understand Ferdinand VII, you must first understand that he was born cursed, not by witchcraft or divine wrath, but by the poisonous legacy of centuries of royal inbreeding. The Spanish Habsburgs and Bourbons had spent generations marrying cousins to cousins, uncles to nieces, creating a genetic nightmare that manifested in everything from mental instability to physical deformities. Ferdinand emerged from this toxic bloodline like a living embodiment of royal decay. Born at El Escorial Palace on October 14, 1784, he was the product of Charles IV and Maria Luisa of Parma, a couple whose own marriage was an arrangement between first cousins. The genetic lottery had been rigged from the start, and Ferdinand would pay the price in the most intimate and humiliating way possible. As he grew from child to adolescent, it became clear that nature had played a particularly cruel joke on the future King of Spain. His member began developing in ways that defied medical understanding. By his teenage years, court physicians were already whispering about the royal anomaly, a dong so massive and strangely shaped that it seemed almost alien in its proportions. Contemporary medical records, hidden away in Vatican archives for centuries, describe Ferdinand's endowment in clinical terms that nonetheless convey the horror of his condition. One physician wrote, "His Royal Highness is afflicted with a member of such extraordinary dimensions and peculiar form that intimate relations may prove challenging." Another was more blunt. "The prince's organ resembles nothing so much as a billiard cue, thin as sealing wax at its base, thick as a man's fist at its extremity, and long enough to serve as a walking stick." The psychological impact on young Ferdinand was devastating. In an era when male anatomy was judged by classical Greek standards, where smaller was considered more refined, more aristocratic, Ferdinand's massive member marked him as a freak of nature. The very thing that modern men might envy became a source of profound shame for the future King of Spain. Ferdinand's childhood was a masterclass in dysfunction that would have broken a stronger man, and instead forged a tyrant. His father, Charles IV, was weak-willed and preferred hunting to ruling. His mother, Maria Luisa, was a woman of voracious appetites, who openly flaunted her affair with Manuel de Godoy, Spain's de facto ruler. Young Ferdinand watched this daily humiliation, absorbing lessons about power, betrayal, and the weakness of trust. But it was his physical abnormality that truly shaped his character. The court buzzed with whispers about the prince's condition. Servants giggled behind their hands, courtiers made subtle jokes, and foreign diplomats reported back to their masters about the Spanish embarrassment. Ferdinand learned early that he was an object of mockery, that his most intimate self was a source of amusement for others. This humiliation bred a deep, festering resentment that would later manifest in his treatment of Spain itself. Ferdinand began to see mockery everywhere, in the respectful bows of his subjects, in the formal addresses of his tutors, in the arranged smiles of potential brides. His paranoia wasn't entirely unjustified. People really were laughing at him, just not always for the reasons he imagined. The prince's tutors noticed disturbing changes in his behavior as he entered adolescence. He became secretive, vindictive, and cruel to those who served him. Servants who displeased him would find themselves dismissed, or worse. Ferdinand was learning to use the power of his position to compensate for the powerlessness he felt about his body. One particular incident, recorded in the memoirs of a court chaplain, reveals the darkness growing in Ferdinand's soul. When a young page accidentally walked in on the prince changing clothes, Ferdinand didn't simply dismiss him. He had the boy flogged and his family exiled from Madrid. The message was clear: no one could witness the prince's shame and remain unpunished. As Ferdinand reached marriageable age, the full extent of his anatomical challenge became clear to the royal physicians. Dr. Francisco Flores, the king's personal doctor, left behind secret notes that provide a disturbing window into the medical reality of Ferdinand's condition. His Majesty's member, Flores wrote, presents a most unusual configuration. The base measures no more than the width of a man's thumb, yet it expands to a circumference that defies natural proportion. The length exceeds that of any recorded human specimen, measuring near to 10 inches in its natural state, and growing considerably larger when aroused. Most concerning is the peculiar curvature and the presence of what appear to be additional tissue growths that serve no discernible biological function. The implications for Ferdinand's future as a husband and father were immediately obvious. Normal intimate relations would be impossible without significant medical intervention and specialized equipment. The royal craftsmen were secretly commissioned to create what they euphemistically called marital aids, specially designed cushions and supports that would allow Ferdinand to function sexually without causing serious injury to his future wives. But the physical challenges were only part of the problem. Ferdinand's condition had psychological ramifications that went far beyond the bedroom. He became obsessed with potions and elixirs that promised to normalize his anatomy or enhance his fertility. Court alchemists and foreign physicians were secretly brought to Madrid, each promising miracle cures that inevitably failed. The prince spent fortunes on these quack remedies. He consumed mixtures of ground rhinoceros horn, powdered pearls, and rare herbs that were supposed to regulate his royal essence. Some potions were meant to shrink his member to normal proportions. Others claimed to enhance his virility despite its unusual shape. All of them were useless, but Ferdinand's desperation made him an easy mark for charlatans and con artists. In 1802, Ferdinand married his first cousin, Princess Maria Antonia of Naples and Sicily. The match was arranged when both were still teenagers, and Maria Antonia arrived in Madrid with romantic notions about her future husband. She had heard he was called the Desired One by some of his supporters, and imagined herself marrying a fairy tale prince. The wedding ceremony was magnificent, as befitted the union of two royal houses. The cathedral filled with music, the streets of Madrid echoed with celebration, and the young couple looked every inch the perfect royal partnership. Maria Antonia was beautiful, intelligent, and genuinely excited about her new life. Ferdinand, for his part, seemed almost normal in public, charming, attentive, and appropriately romantic. But royal weddings end, and wedding nights begin. The first sign of trouble came when Ferdinand's valet approached Maria Antonia's ladies-in-waiting with an unusual request. Special preparations were needed for the royal bedchamber, equipment that the ladies didn't understand but were assured was customary for royal couples. Custom-made cushions were brought in, along with bottles of oils and salves, and various implements that seemed more medical than romantic. Maria Antonia, sheltered and innocent as most royal brides of her era, understood none of this. Her education had been strictly religious, focusing on languages, music, and courtly etiquette. The basic facts of married life had been explained to her in the vaguest possible terms by nervous older women who themselves knew little about the specific challenges she was about to face. When Ferdinand entered the bridal chamber, Maria Antonia's first glimpse of her husband's naked form sent her into hysterics. One lady-in-waiting, writing years later, described the scene. Her Majesty began screaming as though she had seen the devil himself. She backed against the wall, pointing and crying, "Monster, monster," until we feared she had lost her reason entirely. Ferdinand's member, described by witnesses as resembling a great club with a thin handle, was unlike anything the sheltered princess had imagined possible. The sheer size of it terrified her, but it was the bizarre shape, the way it curved and twisted, the strange growths along its length, the almost alien appearance of the whole apparatus, that truly broke her composure. What followed was less a romantic wedding night than a medical procedure. Ferdinand's specially trained physicians had to be called in to explain to the horrified princess what would be required of her. The custom cushions were arranged, the oils applied, and a process began that was more akin to surgery than lovemaking. Contemporary accounts, hidden in private letters between court physicians, describe a scene of almost surreal dysfunction. Ferdinand required the specially designed pillow to support his massive member, preventing it from causing injury to himself during intimate relations. Even with these aids, the process was so traumatic for Maria Antonia that she required laudanum to endure it. The psychological impact on both partners was devastating. Ferdinand, already paranoid and insecure about his condition, became even more twisted when faced with his wife's obvious revulsion. Maria Antonia, meanwhile, developed what modern psychologists would recognize as severe sexual trauma. She began taking larger and larger doses of laudanum, eventually becoming addicted to the substance as a way to escape the horror of her marital duties. Their attempts to produce an heir became a ritualized nightmare that repeated itself with tragic regularity. Ferdinand would summon his physicians, who would prepare the chamber with its specialized equipment. Maria Antonia would be dosed with enough laudanum to make her compliant but not catatonic. The procedure would be performed with clinical efficiency, after which both parties would retreat to separate wings of the palace to recover from their ordeal. As months turned to years without a successful pregnancy, Ferdinand's desperation reached new heights. He became convinced that his wife's obvious disgust was somehow preventing conception, and he began experimenting with increasingly bizarre methods to overcome what he saw as her feminine weakness. Court records reveal that Ferdinand ordered the creation of special restraints that would hold Maria Antonia in position during their intimate encounters, preventing her from pulling away or expressing her revulsion. These leather and silk contraptions were crafted by the same artisans who made the king's saddles and hunting equipment, adding a particularly disturbing dimension to the royal workshops. The king also became obsessed with timing their encounters according to astrological charts and lunar cycles. He consulted with astronomers, astrologers, and even practitioners of darker arts, who promised to align the stars in favor of royal conception. The palace became a haven for charlatans selling fertility potions, magical amulets, and ritual ceremonies that promised to overcome the curse of Ferdinand's deformed anatomy. One particularly desperate episode involved Ferdinand's consultation with a wandering mystic, who claimed to be from the Orient. This supposed wise man convinced the king that his member's unusual shape was actually a sign of divine favor, that he was blessed with the dragon's rod, and needed only the proper rituals to unlock its fertility potential. For 3 months, Ferdinand subjected himself and his wife to bizarre ceremonies involving incense, chanting, and positions that were supposedly based on ancient Chinese texts. Twice, miraculously, Maria Antonia did become pregnant. The court rejoiced, Ferdinand's confidence soared, and Spain held its breath waiting for the birth of an heir to the throne. But both pregnancies ended in devastating miscarriages that left the royal couple more traumatized than ever. The first miscarriage, in 1804, occurred in the 4th month of pregnancy. Court physicians attributed it to the unusual stresses placed upon Her Majesty's delicate constitution. What they meant, but could never say openly, was that Ferdinand's anatomical abnormality had made the sexual act so traumatic that Maria Antonia's body couldn't sustain a pregnancy to term. The second miscarriage in 1805 was even more devastating. This time, Maria Antonia carried the child almost to full term, before losing it in a labor so difficult and bloody that it nearly killed her. The queen never fully recovered from this ordeal, and her addiction to laudanum became so severe that she was essentially a walking ghost for the remaining 2 years of her life. Ferdinand's reaction to these losses revealed the true depths of his selfishness and cruelty. Rather than showing compassion for his wife's suffering, he became convinced that she was deliberately sabotaging their chances of producing an heir. He accused her of taking substances to prevent pregnancy, of deliberately moving in ways that would cause miscarriages, and of harboring secret liberal sympathies that made her unwilling to provide Spain with a proper Catholic heir. These accusations, whispered in the corridors of the palace, destroyed what little remained of Maria Antonia's mental health. She began to believe that she was indeed cursed, that her body was rejecting Ferdinand's seed because of some hidden sin or divine displeasure. Her last months were spent in almost constant prayer, begging forgiveness for sins she couldn't name and crimes she had never committed. When Maria Antonia died in May 1807, at the age of only 21, the official cause was listed as fever and complications from her delicate constitution. The truth was far darker. She had essentially died of despair, her body and mind destroyed by years of sexual trauma, drug addiction, and psychological abuse. But even in death, Maria Antonia couldn't escape the twisted world of Ferdinand's paranoia. Rumors immediately began circulating that she had been poisoned, not by political enemies, but by Ferdinand himself, who had grown tired of her failures as a wife, and wanted to start fresh with a new bride who might be more successful at producing an heir. These rumors were fueled by the suspicious death of the palace apothecary, who was found dead in his chambers just days after Maria Antonia's passing. He had left behind a cryptic letter that was immediately seized by Ferdinand's agents and never seen again. Some whispered that the letter contained confessions about poisons administered to the Queen. Others believed it revealed the true nature of Ferdinand's medical condition and the impossible demands placed on his wife. Ferdinand's behavior following Maria Antonia's death was telling. While he made the appropriate public displays of grief, privately he seemed almost relieved. Within weeks he was already making inquiries about potential second wives, focusing particularly on women who had already proven their fertility by bearing children in previous marriages. The king's physicians, meanwhile, were working frantically to develop new treatments for his condition. If Ferdinand was to remarry successfully, they needed to find ways to make intimate relations less traumatic for his future wives. This led to some of the most bizarre medical experiments in royal history, as doctors attempted to create ever more sophisticated marital aids and develop new surgical techniques that might reshape Ferdinand's anatomy. As Ferdinand approached his second marriage, his character was already showing the twisted traits that would later make him one of history's most despised monarchs. The sexual trauma of his first marriage, combined with his deep-seated insecurities about his physical condition, had created a man incapable of genuine human connection or empathy. Ferdinand had learned to see other people not as individuals with their own feelings and needs, but as tools to be used for his pleasure or obstacles to be eliminated. His first wife had been a tool that failed to function properly and had to be discarded. His subjects were tools for maintaining his power and feeding his ego. Anyone who opposed him was an obstacle that needed to be destroyed. The prince's interactions with the palace staff revealed his growing sadism. He began testing the limits of his power by issuing increasingly arbitrary and cruel orders. Servants who accidentally glimpsed his naked form were not just dismissed, but often disappeared entirely. Guards who failed to maintain absolute secrecy about the royal chambers found themselves assigned to the most dangerous frontier postings in Spain's crumbling empire. Ferdinand also developed an obsession with the idea that people were constantly mocking him behind his back. This wasn't entirely paranoid. People really were talking about his condition, but Ferdinand's response was disproportionate and increasingly violent. He began maintaining lists of suspected mockers and planning elaborate revenge scenarios that he would implement once he had the power to do so. By 1807, Ferdinand had become the center of a complex conspiracy involving some of Spain's most powerful nobles and military officers. These men saw the prince as their vehicle for overthrowing the weak government of Charles IV and his despised minister, Manuel de Godoy. What they didn't understand was that they were allying themselves with a man whose sexual dysfunction had created a personality disorder that would ultimately prove more dangerous than the incompetence they sought to replace. The conspirators called themselves the Fernandinos, and worked tirelessly to build Ferdinand's reputation as El Deseado, the desired one. They spread propaganda about his intelligence, his patriotism, and his potential as a reformist king who would restore Spain to its former greatness. What they carefully concealed was their growing awareness of Ferdinand's psychological instability and his increasingly disturbing behavior toward anyone who crossed him. The conspiracy came to a head in October 1807 with the so-called El Escorial conspiracy, in which Ferdinand was caught planning to overthrow his own father with the help of Napoleon Bonaparte. When the plot was discovered, Ferdinand's response revealed both his cowardice and his complete lack of loyalty to anyone, including his co-conspirators. Rather than standing by the men who had risked everything for his cause, Ferdinand immediately threw them all under the metaphorical carriage wheels. He provided detailed confessions about every aspect of the conspiracy, named every participant and begged his parents for forgiveness while his allies faced imprisonment and exile. This betrayal established a pattern that would define Ferdinand's entire reign. He would use people for his own purposes and then destroy them the moment it became convenient. Even as Ferdinand's political machinations were unfolding, his medical condition continued to worsen. Court physicians noted that his member was continuing to grow and change shape, developing new abnormalities that made intimate relations even more challenging. Some medical historians suggest that Ferdinand may have suffered from a rare condition called megalophallus, a hormonal disorder that causes continued growth of male anatomy throughout adulthood. Whatever the medical explanation, the practical implications were clear. Ferdinand would need increasingly sophisticated aids and increasingly compliant wives if he was ever to produce an heir. This realization led to one of the most disturbing aspects of his later marriages, the deliberate selection of women who could be psychologically manipulated or physically coerced into accepting his demands. The palace craftsmen, meanwhile, had become specialists in creating ever more elaborate marital equipment. Their workshops, hidden away in the depths